In this video, I'll build the main support structures for the gun, that is these two large parts. This step is entirely built out of photo etch. It requires these two very large pieces to be folded up into two rather large parts of the superstructure. In addition to that, a number of struts need to be installed onto both sides of these structures, and then additional beams and a walkway need to be installed on the struts. I will not be constructing the braces that connect the two halves of the gun support structure together. I'll just be completing these steps and these steps. In the next video, I'll connect these two structures that are built in this video together. I'm going to start by removing these large panels from the sprue. This is not a tricky job, but there are a large number of connections, so this does take some time. I do notice that as I cut them off the sprue, they start curving up a bit, which is unfortunate. Ideally, these parts would be perfectly flat. The problem is that there are a lot of small details attached to it, and I'm concerned that if I handle this part too much, those details will break off and it could complicate construction. Once removed, construction can begin. As per the manual, I begin by folding these outer pieces up and into place. You can see that there's additional pieces of photo etch that connect these parts together that need to be cut so that I can fold it into position. I suppose that's to give it a little bit more strength while it is shipping. This part doesn't fit through the notches. It has notches cut into it so that it can go over these slots in the panel. That is because those holes are for where struts will connect in at a later point. On this side, I can see there's also some additional photo etch that needs to be removed, connecting these parts together. It's not clear from the instructions that that should be cut out, but clearly it has to be cut out, otherwise I can't fold these parts up and then into position. So I'll just quickly remove that as well. With that bit gone, I can now fold these panels into their correct position. I see that these parts don't align nicely with the edge. Fortunately, this is the underside of the part, but it does come off as a bit sloppy to me, and I'm concerned that this misfit will continue within this part. While I'm at it, I'm just going to cut that same notch out of the other part and prepare it for folding. I might as well get it prepared at the same time. On this part, you can also see that that panel doesn't fit quite nicely. I think the most important part of this bend to look out for is this part that runs vertically up from the base, because that is the part that is going to be most visible, because you'll be able to view it in from an angle. Okay, time to start gluing this down. You need to hold this panel flat so that it doesn't get kinks in it, and then I'll apply extra thin super glue on a wire from the inside. Hopefully, as I glue down these parts, it'll flatten out this curve and I'll get a good strong structure. This part seems to just fly freely. There's no notch for it to stick into. My only concern here is to not put glue in these slots, because that will then block them for the struts that need to go through on the other side. Just need to be careful of that. Otherwise, I don't think it needs to be perfectly vertical, simply because this will be an internal part that will not be visible once this is all closed up. This glue is seeming to have a bit of trouble sticking, so I'm just going to hold it for a while until it grips. This process is the same for all three sections that need to be folded at this point, so I'll just quickly, rapidly move through all that. You can see that there's still a curve on it, which I hoped would start being eliminated by these parts, but it is still there. That is a bit concerning. I probably should have tried to flatten this out before I started. It's just that the connections for these tabs are so delicate. I'm concerned that I'll break them off if I try and flatten this part. As it is, it's going to be handled a lot, and I'm worried that I'm going to break parts off, and that's going to complicate the build. Now that the first parts are stuck down, it's time to glue this strip that runs along the top in place. It's got a lot of delicate parts on it, and having another panel that's kind of in the way is going to make this a bit awkward. And this metal is fairly thick, so putting these bends on is not as easy as it could have been at the front. So we have this weird mix of the strip at the tip is quite thick and stiff to bend, with all these very delicate details on the side of it that feel like they'll just fall off at a moment's notice. You can quite easily feel when the strip is in the correct position, it almost clicks into place. So that is quite nice. So if I can just hold it in position and then apply the glue to a tab, I think it could make a good bond. This glue seems to be having a bit of trouble holding these parts in place, so I'm just going to accelerate the drying with Super Glue Accelerator. This upper panel is getting in the way. It's quite awkward actually. So now it's time to try and glue down this central tab. Once again, I'll hold it in place with some tweezers and apply extra thin super glue to the edge and hope that it makes a good bond. Accelerate the process with some Super Glue Accelerator. So now that that length of the strip is fairly well glued in place, I'm going to work on this zigzag at the end. Once again, it's got some very delicate parts of it that I'm concerned are going to snap off. I'm starting to think that that is going to be inevitable. This is quite an awkward piece to work with. It's a small piece of photo etch in reality. It's just a small model, but for a piece of photo etch, it's very big, if that makes sense. And this zigzag here at the end is just not quite lining up how I want it to. This is quite frustrating actually. Now there you go, you see now it's starting to fall apart. Oh well. Just have to fix that later. Okay, that's reasonably positioned, so let me just get some glue in there quickly and use some accelerator to make it set. Okay, now for this bit that broke off, let's see if I can get that into position. Mustn't drop it, that would be useful. Okay, so I just put a little bit of extra thick super glue on the part so I can tack it in place, and then once I've got it into what I think is the correct position, I'll come back with extra thin super glue and reinforce the bond. Since this is the underside, I don't mind applying glue to the exterior since it will not be visible. Now to try and build the other side, this is proving more complicated than I had hoped. It's quite difficult to get everything into the right position, and the curve on this part is just not helping things. I think if I didn't have the curve, this would be a lot easier. As I said previously, fortunately, when you do get the part into the correct position, it almost clips into place. Then it's just a matter of holding it steady until you can get some glue on it to permanently bond it in place. Well, that didn't work. Yeah, and there you go, you see the tab just snapped off because it's such a delicate piece. It just had been overhandled. It had been bent one too many times and it couldn't handle the stress, so it snapped. So I have to come back and correct that somehow as well. At least that tab glued down quite easily. So let me put that tab back in to block the hole, because there's now a slight hole where that tab used to be. So I want to fill that up with some photo etch to at least make it look like it wasn't broken off. I'm going to have to come back with a lot of filler to fill up these gaps in this part. As you saw at the end of the clip, the video started to go out of focus, and that's because I started becoming very focused on what I was doing. Essentially, this part was giving me a lot of trouble, and at some point I realized that I needed to abandon the approach that I was taking. The part was being built in such a way that there were lots of misfitting pieces, and there was actually a wave in the part itself, most likely caused by the curve. So I had to abandon it and dissolve all the super glue in acetone and start the construction again. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through some of the challenges that I came across and some of the fixes that I identified for those challenges. The first thing that you need to do is flatten the photo etch as much as you possibly can. I didn't do that on this piece because I thought that when I folded it into position, it would square up. I was concerned that if I tried to flatten the part, some of the more delicate bits would break off. And in fact, some of them did break off. You saw them in the video, and here are some more of them. I had wanted to avoid that, but I came to realize that parts breaking off is not a problem at all. And in fact, in some cases, it makes construction easier. So you need to flatten out the part. You can roll it on a cylinder. I used a jar. And make it reasonably flat before starting construction. And if parts break off, don't worry about it. You can glue them back on later. The first parts to consider are these. They sit internally. You can see them at the bottom over here. Those pieces are hidden underneath the structure, so you don't need to be too careful about how you install them. The most important thing to consider when installing these pieces is to ensure that when you glue them down, they do not block any of these slots. There are other bits of photo etch that will go into these slots, so they need to be unobstructed. There are notches on these parts that should prevent them from blocking the slots, so it shouldn't be too difficult to install them while avoiding the slots. If they are not installed perfectly straight, it does not matter. They will be concealed. You start by gluing these parts on, which is what the manual suggests anyway. Then you have to fold this piece to align with one of the sides and glue it down. In the process of doing that, more pieces might break off, and that is fine. As I've said, that is not a problem. It's actually quite easy to glue this part together, even with most of the tabs detached. What you need to consider when gluing down the central step is that the detail ends over there at the step. It is the same on both sides. It is just a gentle sloping piece. Then there is a zigzag that ends with a smooth finish. There is no detail. This wraps underneath and there is a hole where it is mounted to the railway carriage. Now the reason why I bring this up is because the hole needs to be in a very specific location. This bend needs to sit perfectly on the corner. For example, if you look at this piece, you can see that this corner is right at the very edge. If this part doesn't end exactly on that corner, then there isn't enough space between this part of the carriage and the structure. You have got to get that right. If you don't get it right, this is not going to fit together. Something else to be aware of that is quite difficult to see is that this gentle sloping piece with detail is actually slightly wider than the bit with no detail. That means that these tabs, when folded down, sit recessed and the sloping part sits on top of the walls. The reason why it's important to take note of that is because the smooth part is narrower than the detailed part of the strip. I've aligned the part on this line of the cutting match so you can see the difference in its width, while the line being concealed at the point where the detail starts. What happens at this point is that the strip transitions from going on top of the panel to inside the panel. When looking from above, you don't see the top of the walls where the detail is. But over here, when looking from above, you do see the top of the walls. The final thing to be aware of is that if you fold on all the lines, despite you needing that part to land on this corner, if you try to keep all these sides horizontal and vertical, 90 degrees to each other, it will not end in the correct position. What I did was fold down on this line right at the edge, and then over here I folded it at a wide angle so that it could reach the critical corner. I then used gap filling superglue to fill the gap between the wall that was created with this fold and smooth it off with a file. Since these parts are smooth, this can be done without losing detail. Here is the end result. If while building these parts bits fall off, don't worry. It's quite easy to reconstruct it. There are gaps underneath, so it is possible to access the inside of the structure and apply glue. It is also useful to apply gap filler from the inside to close any gaps between the photo etch joint lines. If you do get super glue on the outside, which is almost inevitable when handling a part this small and complex, just take a brush and wet it with acetone and wipe the affected part until the glue is removed. If it does go all horribly wrong, like the first time I built this part, just give it an acetone bath. The acetone will dissolve all the glue and you can start again. Just don't do this with plastic parts since acetone dissolves many plastics. Those are the quick tips that I have after building this part for the first time. With a bit of luck and if all goes well, you'll end up with something that looks like this. As far as the orientation goes, this is the outside with the less detailed face on the inside. The slope with additional details is the forward section and the less detailed is the aft section. The gun will be positioned something like this. You can see how tight the clearance is. That is why it is important to get those mounting holes the right distance from the corner. If they're even a little bit out, it will push the whole platform that way, which means that they will collide and it can't sit properly. If you have it correctly positioned, it can be seated properly and articulated. Those are the considerations. Now let's see if I can put them into practice while constructing the second part. So here's a large flattened piece of photo etch. I'll start by installing these internal structures as I did before. All of them have been broken off at this point, but as I said, precisely positioning them is not a problem. I'm just trying to avoid filling the slots. Once the internal structures are in position, I then fold this narrow strip into place. And this time I don't try and keep that other panel vertical. I fold it flat down so that I can easily access all the parts. Once again, if it breaks off, I don't care. This makes access a lot easier and I'm much more easily able to get the tabs into the correct position and get the strips glued down. Then for positioning that hole at the very tip, at the underside, follow the advice and place my effort on making sure that that hole is in the correct position. Once again, I break a piece off, but that's not a problem because I can then more easily position it to get that hole into the correct location. Once all the internal structure is complete, I fold over the other face of it and then continue to glue it together from the inside. At this point, I am putting a lot of glue inside the parts to make sure that everything is well joined together. In the process, glue does seep onto the outside and it needs to be removed, so I use a brush wetted with acetone to remove the excess, and then I continue to add more superglue to further reinforce the bonds. I end by applying superglue filler to the blank panels at the forward and after the structure to fill in that gap between the walls of the superstructure. And then once it's dried, I sand it down with a file to get a good flat and smooth surface that is properly aligned with the walls. And then go through another round of applying superglue to the interior and the joints, and I once again wipe it off with acetone. And there you have it. Part number 2, quickly and easily constructed, and it fits well. Now that I'm finished with those 2 pieces of photo etch, and yes, up until this point, technically I've only been working with 2 pieces of photo etch, I can now move on to the installation of these struts. At first glance, there are a lot of them, and yes, there actually are a lot of them. But because there are notches etched into the structure where they'll be installed, installation is actually going to be simplified quite a lot. Cutting them off the sprue and imparting the additional fold goes quite easily. The only thing that can trip us up at this point is if the notches in the structure are poorly located and the parts don't fit. Fortunately, they are in the correct location, and as you can see, the parts very easily fit into the notches. So while holding the part steady, I apply extra thin superglue at the base of the part to glue it into position. I then repeat this process another 5 times for this side of the structure. Now I want to test that these parts are properly aligned, so I'll take this beam and I'll install it inside the notch in the structure. Hopefully this goes well. I can certainly see how this could not fit. The first trick is to make sure that it's orientated correctly, because it's actually not symmetrical, so you do need to make sure that you get it the right way around. But once that is done, it actually fits in remarkably well. Look at that. No problems at all. It just slips right into that notch. That is quite a relief and quite unusual. These things usually fight me. Oh, this is nice. Since it is sitting in there so well, I'll just tack it in place with some extra thin superglue. In front and behind of this main section, there are some more struts that need to be installed. These are done one at a time because they're different size and shape from each other. So it'll be a bit slower to do this, but fortunately there aren't that many that need to be done per side of the structure. Once again, the fit is good, so I'll hold it in place and glue it down with more extra thin superglue from the bottom. Once the 3 individual struts are in place, I can proceed by installing this beam with a bend in it. Unfortunately, this piece is giving me a bit more trouble than that straight one. I just can't seem to get it to fit into the notches correctly. It keeps on wanting to jump out. Well, that's interesting. It actually fits perfectly in that bottom one. Okay, I see what I've made a mistake here. I've put it into the wrong set of notches. I put it into the lower set of notches when it actually needs to go into the upper set of notches. Now that I've put it into the upper set of notches, it fits in perfectly, and I can glue it in place with some extra thin superglue, which I'll also apply beneath it so that it is concealed underneath the beam. Unfortunately, this means that I stuck that longer horizontal beam without a bend in it in the center in the wrong set of notches. I put them in the lower notches, and that in fact needs to go into the upper notches, and that is quite clear if you just look at the instruction manual, which is, I suppose, something that I should have done. Fortunately, this is all photo etch, which means mistakes can be quite easily undone with the application of acetone. So I now need to work on removing this bar. So to do that, I'll just flood the area with acetone. That will soften the superglue and make it such that I can lift out this beam. Yeah, it comes out quite easily. This is fortunate that it is photo etch, and I can correct this mistake without too much hassle. Okay, I need to put in a little bit more acetone. I'm starting to bend this beam a bit. I don't want to damage it or get it too far bent out of shape. Yeah, there we go. Comes out perfectly. So after a little bit of cleanup and straightening, I can now reposition it. This time I will put it into the upper set of notches so that it is in the correct location. Once again, it goes in very easily. So I can just hold it down and re-glue it into position. Now in the process of doing this, I seem to have got a lot of mess onto the part. There's glue in places where it shouldn't be. So I'll once again just use a brush to clean it up a bit. Also on this wire that sticks out of the top of one of the struts, there's a bit too much glue. So I'm going to clean it up as well. Just dissolve most of it. I actually don't really think I need to put glue in there. I probably will stop doing that in the future. Some of the areas I might have overdone the glue removal, so I'll just reapply a little bit of it. This white marking is just excess glue that's now dried to nothing that I'll clean off later when I drop this part in some water. I'll just brush it all off. I can now move on to installing the struts on the other side of the structure. The other side has more parts, but it is essentially the same process. If there is a difference, the difference is that there is only a single piece for the beam that runs along them, which does make it slightly more complicated because now there is a bend on each end. And of course the part is a lot longer, which means there are a lot more notches that need to be properly aligned. Nevertheless, despite the size of this part, it still goes into position relatively easily. And once again, I glue it in place with some extra thin super glue applied to its underneath. Now that the beams have been installed, I can move on to installing the walkways. Since the beams went into their notches quite easily, I live in hope that these walkways will follow suit. The walkways do have railings attached to them, which are quite delicate, so I'll just have to be careful and try to work around them. Not going in quite as easily as I'd hoped, and I can't just press down on them because the railing's in the way. So I'm just going to have to continue to try and gently position them into place. Seem to be making progress now, just getting every little bit aligned with the correct notch. And there it is, it's in place. So now I can apply the glue to stick it down. And now for the other walkway on this side of the structure. This one is considerably shorter, so this should be a lot easier to install. And also, unlike the beam, there's a bend in it, so it's just another straight piece. As hoped, it was easier, so I'll just glue that down to secure it in place. Now for the walkway on the other side. First of all, you can see that this part is considerably longer, so that could make things more complicated. And there's also detail on the other side of the part, which means I can't lay it down flat on the table, so I'll have to elevate it. Fortunately, the ends of this part are clear of any details, which means I can put it on some paint jars like this to hold it off the table and then work on the other side. Somewhat surprisingly, despite being the longer piece of walkway, it was the more cooperative piece of walkway and easily slotted into place, so I glued it down and folded the railing into position. And with that completed this side of the gun support structure. Now this entire process needs to be completed for the other side. This is the exact same process, and as you saw before, everything goes together quite smoothly. So I'll end this video with a nice long montage of me doing about 2 hours of work in 2 minutes. I did find installing these struts to be quite satisfying. They go together very nicely. It's strange that I like that, I suppose, but I think it's because you visually make progress quite quickly on them, and it's nice when parts are just fitting together well. Knowing now to put these beams in the upper slot, I don't make the same mistake again, and that goes together quite easily. The process that I worked through on the first build is then repeated, and I complete the other side of the structure. No need to change something that worked well the first time. And once again, this long beam is quite easy to get into position and glue down. After the installation of the beams, I do a quick cleanup to remove any excess glue and detritus that's left in the part, and I proceed to install the walkways. These walkways are a bit curved, and I think that was part of the problem that I had with the short piece last time, so I just flattened it out on a cylinder and it quite easily slots into its notches, and I glue it down. Once again, I finish by placing the part on 2 jars, and I install the longer railing on the outside of the structure. The second and longer walkway also fits into its notches quite easily, so I glue it down and end the construction by folding up the rail. With that, we come to the end of this video. In the next video, I'll connect these 2 halves together to form the base onto which I can install the gun platform. In the next video for this channel though, I will not be releasing a video on the construction of this kit. Instead, I will be releasing the video for the completed build of the RN Roma. Hope to see you then. Thanks for watching. Cheers.